Yay. Okay, so thank you so much for coming and engaging in this conversation today about the City of Toronto budget. That the consultations around the budget for 2025 have started. The budget will be released in January or February. In February, the final budget, but the consultations have started, and this is the time of the year they always start. And I'm trying to make sure that at Toronto North LIP we are building our capacity to engage in those consultations and to build our members' capacity as well to engage in the conversations around the City of Toronto budget. And that's why this short, very preliminary presentation on the budget consultation process and the budget in general. So looking at City of Toronto, first of all, as a city, it is the largest city in Canada. We have 3 million residents. Now, this is in the Toronto. This is not in the GTA. GTA is more than double, 3 million, but just the Toronto, because this is a City of Toronto budget, does not include the metropolitan areas, is 3 million people, which is 7.6% of Canada's population and 21 Oh, it's more than 21% of Ontario population. Sorry, the 21% is the percentage of Canada's GDP that is produced by GTA. So again, not by the 3 million people in Toronto, but more than double that number in the Greater Toronto area. So, but still a really significant contribution to the economy of Canada. And so this kind of represents those numbers, 3 million in Toronto, almost 16 million in Ontario, and then close to 40 million in Canada. Those are the population numbers. And now we know, as Holly mentioned, that Toronto has a revenue problem. The revenue problem is longstanding. It's not a new thing, but what it looks like right now is a crisis in terms of we are seeing crumbling infrastructure, inadequate services, deep inequity, as Matthew mentioned, in income levels and standard of living for different populations in Toronto. But also Toronto is experiencing continuous year-to-year population growth of approximately 60,000 new people moving into Toronto every year. And Toronto has also one of the best retention rates among Canadian cities, in a sense that 80% of people who move to Toronto are still here 10 years later. This has been a long-standing problem. Revenue was never sufficient for programs and services that the city intended to apply, but it has been worsened by the pandemic and inflation, which sort of tipped it into that crisis situation right now. The question is why? Why does Toronto have this revenue problem? And if you ask the City of Toronto, they will tell you that, and I don't think that this is a matter of opinion, it's a fact. Municipalities' ability to raise revenue, not just in Toronto, but across Ontario and Canada, I'm pretty sure, is frozen in time. Their main way of raising revenue are property taxes. And that hasn't changed in years. That is how the revenue is generated for cities across Canada. However, the pressures on the city have greatly escalated year to year, and we see that almost in real time in Toronto. So that's one of the reasons why Toronto has a long-standing revenue problem. Now let's look at what the expenses and what the revenue money coming in, where does it come from and how much of it comes in, and then also what is it being spent on. And this is looking at the 2024 budget. So we don't have the information yet for this year's budget. So we're just going to look at the information based on last year's budget. City's operating budget is $17.1 billion. That's what the city needs in order to run its programs and services on an annual basis. Last year, city faced a shortfall of $1.7 billion that they didn't have to operate the services as they needed. So the money comes, as you see, majority of it comes from the property tax. Federal and provincial revenue is next, and I believe that this reflects the numbers from the new deal that City of Toronto secured with the province of Ontario. But in the previous years, this was much less. We'll talk about the new deal and what it covers. And then other sources of revenue are rate programs. So things that we use in Toronto that we pay a rate for, we pay for those services. Transit fares, land transfer tax is another, which is a Toronto unique revenue source. At least that's what I heard during the first virtual budget consultation with the mayor. Mayor did a little opening, and she mentioned that land transfer tax is actually unique to Toronto. And so but it presents 5.1% of the total city revenue. User fees, investment income, transfers from capital, and then fines. And obviously, I immediately think about the parking tickets and the millions of them I've paid over the years. That's 1.2% of the city budget. Now, moving on to where does the money go? What does the city spend this operating budget on? They spend 28% of it to fund they're called co-shared social programs. So to cover the city portion of shelters, daycare, emergency medical services, public health, and income support programs. That's where 28% of the city operating budget is spent. Yes, Matthew.
Sorry to interrupt, and I'm just looking at it says emergency medical services, and then two things down is emergency services. So is the medical separate from like fire and police? Is that fire and police and the emergency services? Is that how it goes?
Thanks for asking. This is what I've been trying to puzzle out the whole morning. I believe that emergency services includes the police. This is really the police budget. Because when you go to the budget consultation, you will see that what it looks like to me that aside from co-shared social programs, the two largest expenses that the city pays for that are fully city responsibility are transit and police, and their budget is almost equal to each other. Yes, so that was confusing to me as well, and I've been trying to search and look at different documents to better understand it, but that's my current understanding right now. So again, I don't know what a lot of this, a lot of this is city jargon. When they say other agencies, what are they talking about? Because TTC, Transit, is an agency of City of Toronto. But there are other agencies, like the Exhibition Place is an agency as well. And so their governance, there's government structure at the city that also is kind of opaque, and knowing that would shed more light on this cost distribution. But this is where I'm at right now with my understanding. So now looking at the other part of budget, which is the capital cost, the capital budget. So City of Toronto has a huge amount of value in its capital assets, including parks, buildings, facilities, vehicles. Toronto community housing belongs to the city, transportation infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, TTC, all of its infrastructure, and trains and vehicles, and water and wastewater infrastructure. So there's a lot there in assets, but the cost of maintaining it all and upgrading it is also significant. And so the capital budget only is available that I was able to find over a 10-year period. And over a 10-year period, it's $49.85 billion. And again, if you look at where's that money coming from, you see that one observation is that most of the rate services sort of pay for themselves, like water pays for itself, pretty much. But when it comes to things like transit, even though it's a fee for service, it requires additional, so the operating piece is one part of the budget, but then also the cost of maintaining, upgrading TTC is a significant part of the costs, the capital costs. So does this help much in terms of where the city spends money on water, um, on transit, on housing, on transportation, which would be the transportation infrastructure, environment and recreations, parks, CREM? What is that? I don't know. Does anybody know what that is? No, again, city jargon. They really need to make this more accessible. Um, and emergency services. So think about paramedics. They are also city operated, even though there's a cost to users. And then other, 10%. So fairly large chunk, and we don't know what's included in that. Again, this is from last year's budget. So because of this shortfall of $1.77 billion to cover the operating costs of the city and some of its capital costs, the City of Toronto was able to secure a new deal with the province of Ontario in November 2023. Yes, Matthew. Go ahead.
Again, sorry, but just I did a quick search. CREM is Corporate Real Estate Management Division,
All right.
responsible for operational day-to-day stewardship and planning of the city's real estate assets.
Yes. So it's yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you. So it's the property managers that manage the city assets. Somebody needs to pay them and pay for their services. That's how I understand that. But that's really good. It's good to know. So in November 2023, City of Toronto secured a new deal with the Ontario government, whereby the Ontario government committed to paying for part of the costs that the city was not able to cover. And specifically, they committed to funding for Gardiner Expressway and Don Valley Parkway for maintenance, continued maintenance, that will save city, according to their calculations, $2 billion over 10 years, and could save more than that once all the costs are factored in. They also committed to 330 million in transit operating funding to support, and that's over 3 years. So all of these are over different time frames, to support the new LRT light rail transit lines, the Eglinton Crosstown and Finch West. So money towards transit, 600 million for shelter operations and homelessness support. And this is, but this hinges on whether federal government provides additional funding to support refugees and asylum seekers. And this is a good example of how the city is covering costs for services that really are the responsibility of other levels of government. Unfortunately, we saw that played out on real people's lives, on very vulnerable people's lives with the asylum seeker crisis. But just to give you an idea, there are 6,000 asylum seekers in Toronto shelters as of September this year. That represents 60% of all shelter spots in Toronto, emergency shelters, and that's an increase of 600% just for refugee asylum seekers from 2021. And the city is obviously housing asylum seekers, not at there is more demand than the city has spaces for. The federal government has stepped in, but the ways that they've stepped in has been taking people out of the shelters, city shelters, and moving them to federal shelters in other municipalities, and also purchasing shelter spaces in Toronto hotels for refugee asylum seekers, but it's not enough. And this funding from the province of Ontario towards city budget hinges on whether the federal government provides additional funding to support the refugee and asylum seekers. And so that pressure is taken off the city of Toronto. They're also covering the cost of 55 new subway trains, but again, only if the federal and municipal governments each provide, if the federal government provides matching funding. Also, 300 million in one-time funding for subways and transit safety, which includes the safety and police officer, expansion of cell access and data services across the TTC network. So that funding came from the province of Ontario, as well as funding. Now, this is interesting. This is also contingent funding, 342 million, but only if the city exceeds its housing target of building new housing units by 125 in each of the 3 calendar years. So I do believe that the new deal with Ontario is for 3 years, based on the information that I'm gleaning from these items that they are covering and for the period of time they are. And so I'm not sure what happens after that, but the conversations are ongoing. This new deal reduces the shortfall, but the city was still left on line for over 600 million of a budget shortfall even after this new deal. And so the city then found efficiencies, and that's how they balanced the budget, the last year's budget. They found 600 million in efficiencies, but they also raised interest rates by 9.5% because that was the first lever they had to increase the revenue. So the property taxes, when I say interest rates, the property taxes, 9.5% increase. But even with that, they had to find $600 million in efficiencies. And I'm not sure where exactly that money came from. But those are all things that I've found by participating in the virtual consultation. It's possible to ask. There are counselors at the consultations and city staff, and they're able to jump in and answer questions. So the way the consultations virtually have worked is that they are breakout rooms. So they're breakout rooms of about 10 to 12 citizens and other staff from the city and counselors. And so if questions are raised, then the city staff or the counselors can jump in with some background information. And so current challenges for the city budget is our rising inflation, the increase in interest rates, although we're hearing that there's going to be changes there as well, but the trend's been an increase in interest rates, supply chain disruption, specialized labor shortages. Matthew, you spoke about this, a very competitive labor market. And there should have been another bullet, obligations associated with transit expansion, as well as a growing demand from services due to the growth in population. And also because people are barely making ends meet. So there is a growing demand for services. So the way that the city frames this, that despite being responsible for more than 60% of the services and infrastructure that residents rely on each day, so 60% of roads, hospitals, 60% of costs for all these services and infrastructure, city only receives 9% of all the tax dollars. So this is not, this is looking at the income tax that we all pay from our paychecks, provincial and federal tax. And when you also put in the property tax that we pay on properties, it's only 9% of that big pie of money. And while they say that 25%, I mean, and this is, I guess, a fact, but this is how they're positioning their argument that the federal and provincial government both need to contribute more. 25% of the city's property tax funding goes towards federal and provincial responsibilities, including housing, social services, and health services. So that's why the city of Toronto has a revenue problem. And the ask now, what the new deal has been secured with the federal government, with the provincial government. The ask of the federal government is for $2.7 billion. Partially because the dollars that the Ontario government has promised hinge on contribution from Ottawa. But also, and specifically in that new deal, the money that should come from the federal government is for things like flood protection in Toronto East Harbor, wiping out the city's debt from the COVID-19 expenses, support for asylum seekers and refugees, which I've read opinions and commentators say that that is possibly likely the only thing that City of Toronto will get from the federal government. And then also additional money to build beds in the city's homeless shelter. So that's what the City of Toronto is asking the federal government for. And that has also been built into the New Deal between Ontario and City of Toronto. So it's mentioned in there. And so that some of the Ontario dollars hinge on whether the federal government comes forward with their contribution. In terms of the city budget process, right now, and especially this week and next week, cities holding budget consultations. And those are both in person and online. And then staff will prepare a budget that will then go to the mayor for mayor to develop the budget after the staff do their bit. And then it will be there will be a special budget meeting at the city's council on February 11th. So the city budget is released in February, but Ontario and federal budgets are released in March or April based on last year. So I've looked at when we heard about the Ontario and federal budgets. It looks like March or April is when they're released. Toronto, the pre-budget consultations at the federal level have already started. They're available here. There's a link. I can put it in chat. And the interesting thing about it is that now they're hearing from witnesses and also pre-budget submissions. So various organizations, associations, and interest groups are submitting their pre-budget statements and submissions to the House of Commons in preparation for the development of the federal budget. So I've looked to see if OCASI, which is relevant to us, Ontario Coalition of Agencies Serving Immigrants, has made a pre-budget submission. They have not yet, but they do that every year. So I would hope that they would submit one soon. But Matthew, for you, you're in the food security space. There's probably a different organization that would be making that sort of submission. Now, this is my last slide, but what I have here is a video from Social Planning Toronto from last year that explains the budget quite well. We're not going to listen to the whole hour. It's really only about 10 minutes. So since we have a bit of time, would you be okay with listening to a few minutes of an overview of last year's budget so we can better understand and it can fill in some of the gaps in some of the information I have shared. Okay, cool. Well, let's do that. I want to make sure that you can hear it. Give me a moment. So how do I do that? And now you get to see my tabs again. 1 second. So first of all, can you hear it? Let's do that.
How they're going to raise revenues for those
Yes.
programs,
Okay, great.
infrastructure. And we know it's so important to the quality of life of Toronto residents, of communities across the city. And you can
Now you muted yourself. I can't hear it.
And I'm so glad we're
There
going
we
to
go.
talk about that. Issues finding affordable housing or childcare, access to programs and services such as recreation, libraries, children and youth services, newcomers, senior services, as well as looking at how our city is doing in response to the climate emergency, or advancing some of the city's strategies around truth and reconciliation, around poverty reduction. It all comes back to the city budget and the decisions that are made there. Last year's budget, so the city of Toronto has a very large budget, and last year's budget, its operating budget was over $16 billion. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And its 10-year capital plan was over $49 billion. So the city of Toronto has a larger budget than many of the provincial governments and all of the territories, as the largest city in Canada. And then we're thinking about that money. Where does the money go? So the operating budget is about the day-to-day spending on services. A lot of that is staffing and different resources. And you can think of the range of services that the city provides, sometimes cost shared with provincial and federal governments, sometimes completely through city revenues. So some examples under the operating budget would be recreation programs, the parks maintenance, the work of the amazing gardeners in the city, public health services, transit operations, police, fire, paramedic services, all fall within the operating budget. The capital budget is all about infrastructure, facilities, assets of the city that support the services that are provided. And you can think of some of the examples when the city purchases vehicles for public transit, the subway trains, streetcars, buses, or they construct new transit stations or do work, major repair work in terms of roads, bridges, building new bike lanes, and the public buildings, the civic centers, the libraries, the community and recreation centers, all part of that capital budget, as well as the infrastructure and parks, such as playground equipment, splash pads, water fountains, washrooms, all part of the capital budget. And the city has three rate-supported programs. So rate-supported budgets are funded almost entirely by user fees. So the rates that we pay for those particular services, and they're Toronto Water, solid waste management services, so that's garbage collection, it's recycling and the green bin. Toronto Parking Authority, that green P parking or parking on the side of the road, are part of the rate-supported programs. Some of the thinking about the operating budget, where the money comes from to pay for those programs and services, these are the top revenue sources. So this from last year, about 30% from property taxes. Federal and provincial funding make up about 26%. The rates, the fees we pay for water, garbage, recycling, green P parking are about 13%. Transit fares make up almost 8%. And municipal land transfer tax is about 6%. So if you buy a home and you're not a first-time home buyer with an exemption, you would pay that MLTT. And those are some of the sources. So this past year, the City of Toronto City Council passed a long-term financial plan. And I just want to try to, it's a big, long document and process. I want to try to sum it up just with a few highlights, or not such highlights maybe. And it looked at what is the extent of the financial crisis, financial problems of the city, and how they're going to try to address that problem. And there were a few key takeaways. So over a 10-year period, they calculated that they were short, they had a budget shortfall over that 10 years of about $46.5 billion, that they didn't have the revenue. And they really identified it as a crisis, and they've never had sufficient revenues for the programs and services that they are trying to deliver, but it's really been made worse by the pandemic and by the impact of inflation. The messages in that long-term financial plan that Toronto City Council adopted were that the city has to act now to start to try to raise revenues, to look at how can they contain costs in ways that are not damaging in terms of public services. They've started to do some of that work. The city can't do it alone. Even if they do everything in the long-term financial plan, it won't be enough. They need the federal provincial government, and they need a new deal. And as Melissa was mentioning, there was a new deal struck yesterday. So it's kind of a beginning, I think, of a process, but important announcements yesterday between the Ontario provincial government and the City of Toronto that will certainly help the city. But I think one thing we really heard from Mayor Chow was that it's not enough. It's a good start, and there's lots to unpack in that deal, but it's not enough to deal with the budget deficit for 2024, which is $1.5 billion. They're starting out needing that additional amount of money. And it's not enough in the long run. So there's a lot more work to be done. So that's a bit of the context